Phoebe here, and it's the first of our stories for adults. And this one is called Mr. Fox. I should just say that it has some very adult content in it. So if you have some older children that want to watch, then just be aware of that. I would suggest you listen first and then decide whether you want to share it with the older members of your household. Mr. Fox is the story that I'll be telling, and it was collected by Joseph Jacobs, who was a story collector who came from Australia but emigrated to this country, and when he was out walking about in the countryside he would collect stories, and Mr. Fox was one of the ones that he collected. My version of the story combines several stories, so in the main it is Mr. Fox, but it also combines other stories with a similar theme. One is by the Grimm brothers, which is called The Robber Bridegroom, and the other one, which it has echoes of, which you may be aware of, is one by Charles Perrault, which is Bluebeard's Chamber. So, without further ado, here is the story of Mr. Fox. There was a widow who lived in a manor house with his only daughter. Elizabeth was as radiant as the sun, as loyal as the moon, and as patient as the stars. Now, her father knew that he needed to make her a good match in order to secure her future. And so, when a noble gentleman came calling, named Mr. Fox, he thought, this looks like a fine gentleman. He had fine clothes, he had money, he had land, and, according to him, a very fine house. And so Elizabeth's father allowed this courtship to continue. It went on for many days and weeks and months, and eventually there was a date set for the wedding. Elizabeth was to be married to Mr. Fox. Now, Elizabeth didn't mind this. She knew that the times were that her father would choose her husband for her, and Mr. Fox was a handsome man, and he had fine clothes and money, and as he said, he seemed to have land and a good house. So what was there not to like about Mr. Fox, really? But there was something that just didn't quite sit right with her, but she wouldn't have actually told her father that. Instead, Elizabeth went along with the arrangements. And one day when Mr. Fox was sat eating supper with them, he said, "Elizabeth, dear Elizabeth, you must come and visit me at my house in the woods." "But surely," said Elizabeth, "that would not be seemly for me to do that before we are married." "Oh no, never you mind, we will be married and it won't be a problem." Elizabeth tried again. "But I don't know where you live," she said. "Oh, don't worry about that," said Mr. Fox. "As you're going through the wood, I will mark on the trees with a bit of chalk where you have to go. So you'll be able to follow the marks of chalk all the way through the woods to my fine manor house." Well, there was no more that Elizabeth could argue with, and so she agreed. The next evening she would go to Mr. Fox's house and have dinner with him and then return home. She was very determined about that. So, the next evening came, and as she set off into the forest, her father had given her a good loaf of bread and a bottle of wine, and she went into the forest and she saw the marks on the trees and she was able to follow them, and so she did. And she followed them all the way through until she reached one solitary manor house with quite a bit of land around it, but still deep in the wood. And the lights were on, and she knocked on the door, and she pushed the door open, and she called out, "Hello!" But there was no reply. Nothing. So she stepped in a little further. After all, she had been invited. And she saw in the middle of the room a long table, all set for dinner for more than 2 people, which perplexed her. But she continued, this must be the right house. And as she stepped in through the door, there was a raven in a cage hanging from the roof. And it said, be bold, but not too bold, lest your heart's blood run cold. It's a very strange thing to teach your birds to say, thought Elizabeth. How very peculiar. She thought nothing more of it. After all, it was just a bird in a cage. And so she went into the house and she looked and she could see the fire was going well. And she could see there was a little room off beside the fire. And so she went to have a look in that room. And as she pushed the door open, the bird said, be bold, but not too bold, lest your heart's blood run cold. And so she moved into the door, just ignoring the bird, because after all it was just a bird. And she could see there are many casks of wine there. Clearly Mr. Fox liked wine. And so she had a little look around to see if she could see any more rooms, but she couldn't. And then as she was looking, she heard this almighty noise coming from the wood outside, this screaming, blood-curdling sound. And as she looked out through the windows, she could see Mr. Fox and several other men dragging a woman by her hair through the wood. What on earth could this mean, thought Elizabeth. She was too late to be able to get out through the front door without being seen. And so, with all these barrels there, surely she could just hide behind them, and that's what she did. So she went into the little room and left the door open, though, as it had been, so as not to raise suspicion, and hid behind the barrels. It wasn't long before Mr. Fox and his band of men arrived in the house, dragging the woman screaming through the door. They put her down on the table and pinned her down, and they poured wine down her throat. They poured red wine, white wine, yellow wine, and then her heart burst. She died. Elizabeth could not believe what she'd just seen. She clamped her hand over her mouth to try and stop herself from screaming out. She could not believe that this was the man that she was to marry, who had just killed this woman right in front of her. Well, then, what appeared to be a band of robbers set about, stripping the woman of her fine silk clothes and her jewellery. And then it became apparent that they were going to cut her up and put her into the pot that was on the stove. They were going to eat her. It was the most horrific thing that Elizabeth had ever seen, and she was biting down on her finger to try and stop herself from screaming. As they were trying to pull the rings off the woman's fingers, they couldn't get it off. One of the men raised a knife and brought it down on the finger, and it came off and flew high, high, high up into the air and down, 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 down Elizabeth's front. Well, it was a good job Elizabeth had bit down on her finger, because now she was really finding it hard not to scream. And the men, they wanted to know where it had gone, where the diamond ring that was on that finger had disappeared, and they were searching high and low for it. And thankfully, they too had had quite a bit to drink. And so they gave up and they sat down to feast. Elizabeth stayed shaking behind the barrels. The men, they feasted, they drank, they sang. They seemed to have no conscience. And eventually they fell asleep, sated on the food and the drink. Elizabeth was able to creep out from behind the barrels, creep around the men, and thankfully the bird did not say a word. And she moved out through the door and she ran back through the forest home. Well, of course, when she got home, she could not tell her father what she had seen, for who on earth would believe her? And so Elizabeth thought, in a week, I am to be married to this man. What am I to do? And then she came upon a plan. The week came round and Elizabeth's wedding day arrived, and she played the part of a bride very well. She married Mr. Fox. And they were all sat at the wedding feast, and they were all talking, and she was very quiet. And Mr. Fox turned to his bride and he said, "Why so quiet, my love?" "Oh, I had a strange dream last night," she said. "Oh," he said, "well, it was just a dream." "Well, I don't know, she said. This was really strange. Let me tell you about it. I went into a wood where there was a manor house stood in the middle of the wood, and the lights were on, and as I went in there was nobody there, but the table, it was laid for many people. Sounds like a very strange dream, said Mr. Fox. It was not so, and it will not be so. But then there was a bird in a cage, said Elizabeth. The bird, it shouted, be bold, but not too bold, lest your heart's blood run cold. I did not understand what it meant, but I was to find out. Do not worry yourself, wife, said Mr. Fox. It was not so, and it will not be so. I do not know, she said. For then I saw some men coming in from the wood, dragging a woman behind them by her hair, and she was screaming. And so I hid behind the wine barrels while they brought her in. Oh, wife, shush, it was just a dream. It was not so, and it will not be so. I do not know, said Elizabeth. For then they put her on the table, and they forced wine down her throat, red wine, white wine, then yellow wine, and her heart burst, and she died right there in front of me. It was as much as I could do not to scream, she said. Wife, it was not, and it will not be. I do not know, she said. Because then the men, they cut up the woman, and they put her in a pot. They were going to eat her. And then there was a ring on her finger that they couldn't get, and they cut the finger off, and it flew off up into the air. Wife, it was not and will not be, said Mr. Fox. Then what is this? Said Elizabeth, and she pulled the finger with the ring on it from her dress. Well, Mr. Fox went white, knowing that his deeds had been found out and he was undone. And all of the other noblemen that were there at the feast realised what had happened, and that the rumours that they had heard about Mr. Fox and his many, many wives were indeed true. And so the only thing that can happen to somebody that has committed such an atrocious deed did happen. Mr. Fox was hung. And because Mr. Fox was put to death for his deeds, and Elizabeth had already married Mr. Fox, it meant that all of his land, his manor house, his riches, his fine clothes, they all went to Elizabeth. And she and her father lived very well for many years. I hope you enjoyed that rather gruesome tale. It's one of my favourites to tell. I just love the cunningness of Elizabeth at the end there, and the sheer horror that she has to endure is quite incredible. I'll be back again later in the month with another story. I will be telling the Selkie and the Fisherman. It will be my version of it. So I hope you'll join me for that one, and I'll see you next time. Toodle pip.